My name is Peadar Duffy. I'm the founder and chairman of Risk Management International, RMI, which has been in business now in Ireland for over 20 years. I am a member of the Risk Management Standards Committee of the NSAI. Now, the NSAI is the Irish representative organisation to ISO. I am one of the two Irish risk experts working with Working Group 2 to ISO 31000, where we are undertaking a limited revision of ISO 31000. The topic of my conversation here today is board risk assurance. What is board risk assurance? Board risk assurance is assurance that strategy, objectives and execution are aligned. That strategy, objectives and execution are aligned. How do you align strategy, objectives and execution? You do it by operationalizing the links between risk and strategy. Operationalizing the links between risk and strategy. There are 5 parts to my presentation. Where is risk today? The relationship between risk and strategy, putting strategy, objectives and execution at the very centre of the board agenda. Lessons learned over the past 2 decades, operationalizing the links between risk and strategy, and then finally I will draw my conclusions. This is where risk is today, or rather this is a slide on the evolution of risk management up to the point where enterprise risk management was a conceptual infant. This document here is sourced from the Institute of Management Accountants and was authored by Professor Bill Schenker. Bill in the 1990s described enterprise risk management as containing 4 principal buckets of risk: strategic, financial, operational and hazard. This is RMI's view of the next stages in the evolution of risk management. The 4th pillar is the resilience pillar, and we accept no plaudits for thought leadership in this regard, because resilience is something which is gaining currency very quickly around the world. From our point of view, particularly with the Global Risk Report that came from the World Economic Forum in 2013. But our particular perspective on resilience causes us to dwell for a moment on the difference between measurable uncertainties and unmeasurable uncertainties. What do I mean by this? Risk is the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of objectives. Risk is some jeopardy or some threat about which there is some ambiguity, about which there is some uncertainty. There are 2 types of uncertainties: measurable uncertainties and unmeasurable uncertainties. On the bottom right-hand corner of the slide in front of you, you will see that there are 2 of the big buckets of risk, financial and hazard risks, which are described under the heading of measurable uncertainties. Now, hazard risks are risks which are inherently insurable because they occur in very large number and with sufficient frequency for them to be discernible, for them to be reckonable, for them to be such that management can manage them on a daily basis, and they can then be managed residually through transfer out through insurance. Financial risks are today regarded as being risks which are mastered. What do I mean by that? Best described and explained in the context of 2 reports that were undertaken at the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s. They were unconnected reports into major value collapse events. 2 reports were undertaken by Mercer and separately by Booz Allen Hamilton. These reports separately concluded that in the order of 85% to 92% of the major value collapse events that occurred in the years leading up to then had their root causes associated not with financial risks or hazard risks, but strategic and operational risks. Measurable uncertainties are funded out of operating profits. It's important that we understand and remember that. Now let's consider for a moment unmeasurable uncertainties. Unmeasurable uncertainties are inherently unreckonable because they do not occur with such frequency for us to be able to understand likelihood. We certainly understand their impacts. These days, unmeasurable uncertainties are driven substantially by dint of the hyper-connected, multi-speed uncertain world in which we live. Unmeasurable uncertainties typically precipitate very significant negative reputational impacts. Unmeasurable uncertainties are funded from the balance sheet. In our view, in years to come, the term risk and risk management are likely to be subordinated to the term resilience and resilience management. Why is that so? We believe that corporate resilience will become an imperative in senior and mainstream business management, on foot of the fact that business models are becoming more global. They're becoming more 24/7. There are very few organizations today which are vertically integrated. More core processes, more core functions are being outsourced. There's more uncertainty in day-to-day operations. So clearly, as there are more unmeasurable uncertainties than measurable uncertainties, and because unmeasurable uncertainties ultimately are funded out of the balance sheet and precipitate very negative reputational impacts, it is important that boards of directors have a strategic risk framework which can accommodate two things. First and foremost, risk-taking and monitoring at the group level, at the senior corporate levels, and then separately, performance monitoring and controls at the subsidiary levels. Boards of directors need to understand the links between risk and strategy because of the uncertain world in which we live today. This slide describes the relationship between risk and strategy. What does the word strategy mean? The word strategy comes from the Greek strategos, art of the general. In the 21st century, we understand strategy as long-range planning. So at the very center of the board agenda, at the very center of the relationship between risk and strategy is long-term purpose and formulating strategy. The top left-hand quadrant relates to the whole matter of identifying threats and obstacles to objectives. Objectives setting should be considered in the context of driving a car. I want to drive from New York to Washington, D.C., from Mumbai to Kolkata, from Berlin to Paris, from London to Paris. So long as I understand where I'm going, where I want to get to, clearly I know where I'm starting from, I simply have to work out what can stop me, what can distract me, what can throw me off on my journey from point A to point B. Once people understand that risk management in this context is prospective, I'm driving my car to a location. I know where I want to get to. That is my objective. I do not drive my car looking through the rear view mirrors. Driving risk management like driving a car is not retrospective. Once people understand this, they then realize that risk management, in fact, is not a compliance burden. Risk management enhances the achievement of objectives. It enhances performance. We now move to the top right-hand quadrant of the diagram in front of you. This talks about the importance of aligning objectives in a strategic and an operational context. Now, many people might think that this is commonplace, that this is something which happens rather automatically within organizations. But in fact, the larger the organization, the more complex the organization, the more difficult it is to get assurance that objectives are aligned. Why? Let's consider a group CEO of a large behemoth organization with multiple moving parts. He or she will spend up to 20% of his or her time communicating with principal stakeholders, ensuring that there are no shocks or surprises on either side of the relationship. Thereafter, he or she is concentrating on keeping in place and in motion those principal components of this large behemoth organization. How do they do that when, at the same time, they cannot cut across the responsibility and the authority of subsidiary CEOs? They do that through the wise and skillful application of group functions, the C-suite, and also governance frameworks. Risk is one of those governance frameworks. One of the ways in which you can test the alignment of your objectives is through the commencement and development of conversations on the whole question of developing risk appetite statements. Saying to the subsidiary CEOs, These are the group objectives. These are the statements describing the group's appetite for risks to those objectives. What are your appetites for risk to your objectives? That whole conversation ultimately peels back the layers of complexity such that the C-suites, but also the non-executive directors on the all-important risk committee or the audit committee if it has a charter extension to include risk, those all-important conversations strip away confusion with regards to the operating models, what matters most with regards to the business model. This is the most important quadrant within the diagram. But the bottom right-hand quadrant is the one where is the real business of risk management. This is where the rubber meets the road. Risk treatment. When we look at risk registers, we're quite often amazed that some 80% of the content, or if I put it visually, I look at an Excel spreadsheet, which far too often are being used these days as the reporting and process management mechanism for the identification and management of risks. We find that some 80% of the content, 80% of the surface area on that risk register is given over to the area of risk assessment. But what about the treatment of risks? I want to get from point A to point B. What safeguards am I going to employ? How am I going to reduce my risks? I need to know what given people are going to do that is measurable within timeframes with the desired performance effect of reducing the risk to an objective or risks to an objective. This is the business end of board risk assurance. In fact, risk treatments are leading indicators of the future state of health of objectives. When we look at a risk heat map, you know those maps, red, amber and green, and we look, for example, at the red area, we actually aren't looking at risks through our eyes. What we're looking at is the state of health of the objectives. The more risks in that zone, the higher the blood pressure of the organisation, the less likely that those objectives perhaps are going to be achieved. So as I say again, risk treatments is the business end of board risk assurance. Moving on then to the bottom left-hand quadrant, weighing the odds consistently throughout the organisation. I'm going to come back to this in a moment when I speak to the topic of risk maturity. So we now then get to the first ring around the diagram in front of you, the compliance ring, governance and compliance with rules and regulations. The reality is that when an organisation determines what its future is and how it's going to get there, responsible professional directors will decide, of course, that they're going to operate in accordance with the law, rules and regulations and best practices. But the organisation hasn't been created to operate within the law. It has been created to achieve a long-term purpose, but with due regard to the rule of law, rules and regulations. What's central to the board agenda is knowing where we're going, what can stop us and distract us, and how we manage those things that can stop us and distract us. Compliance is mission critical, but it is an operational imperative. It is a sunken cost. It rarely drives value into the organisation. Now we'll go to the topic on the very top of your graph, of your diagram rather, tough governance. What is tough governance? Tough governance is risk culture. What is risk culture? Well, first and foremost, what is culture? Simply put, culture is the way in which we do things around here. The way in which we do things around here. That's what culture is. Risk culture, you could say theoretically, is a subset of culture. And risk culture is the freedom we have to challenge around here. The freedom we have to challenge around here. Now, when the board of directors sets the tone from the top and does various things that causes people to believe in their sincerity, that board of directors wants to get the bad news first, before Twitter for sure, what happens? The tone from the top will meet information from the bottom, midways. Boards, senior executives, senior managers will get the bad news first, ahead of Twitter, and take the preventive actions. That's what tough governance is about. So again, on this slide, understanding that, the importance of risk culture, but the bottom right-hand quadrant. Risk treatment are leading indicators of the future state of health of objectives. Tracking, monitoring these leading indicators of the future state of health of these objectives requires that we put system to process. 3 key words, putting system to process, 4 words in fact. But before I go there, I just need to reflect for a moment on the lessons that we have learnt over the last 2 decades. And I'm going to make reference now to 3 studies. They are incredibly important studies, helping us to understand that what matters really are people and preparation. The first study is the impact of catastrophes on shareholder value. This study was undertaken in the mid-90s by Deborah Petty and Rory Knight. They discerned that you could determine in the first 10 to 50 days of a major catastrophic event which companies were going to recover and which companies were not going to recover. The recoverers were companies where there was a lesser impact on cash, impacts on society, fatalities, but most importantly also those where management responsibility was identified, but more to the point, where management's talent in the new circumstances in which they found themselves was such that confidence was being regained. In fact, one of the principal conclusions of the report was that the dominant factor which influenced recovery or non-recovery was not the direct impacts on cash and so forth, but in fact it was the indirect factor of management talents in these abnormal, adverse circumstances. Why? Because it caused third parties to reassess future cash flows and future prospects of the company, given the management talents that were hitherto not reflected in the value of the organisation. There are 2 additional reports which have recently been published by IRMIC. And at this point I'd like to thank IRMIC CEO John Hurrell for the provision of this information, and also the next slide that I think you will find really interesting. The points on this slide here are self-explanatory. What matters? What story are they telling us? They're telling us that people matter, that preparation matters, and that proving and testing matters. When we look at the results of those 2 reports, Roads to Ruin and Roads to Resilience, which I think are a must-read for any chief officer in an organisation, we think of the RMI tell me, show me, prove it to me tests. What are those tests? When we start the conversation with the CEO of an organisation, with the chair of the audit committee, the chair of the risk committee, whichever it will be, we ask them to tell us about the long-range plan, about the strategic plan, about the risk management framework, the board audit committee and risk committee. And we will be told about the very good people that no doubt exist within those committees and so forth. We'll be told of the external attestations, exemplary attestations quite often. And we will walk away from those meetings feeling, good Lord, this is really quite a good organisation. We will score them in our minds 9 out of 10. The conversation develops as the relationship develops, and we ask people to show us their risk registers, show us the strategic plans, show us how objectives are linked to risks, or more to the point, risks are linked to objectives. Show us the top 5 contingency plans for the top 5 risks on the corporate register. We become disappointed quite often. The scores drop to 5 out of 10. We find that risk registers are incomplete. There are no objectives stated. We find that, for example, risk appetite statements, if they do exist, and they don't always exist, are rarely ever communicated out to the key constituents within the organisation. We then move on in the relationship and we ask the RMI prove it to me questions. Prove to me that the top 5 risks are really the right top 5 risks. Prove to me that the risk register is not just a list of risks. The scores in this instance will drop to 2 out of 10. So the RMI tell me, show me, prove it to me tests result in scores of 9 out of 10 to 5 or 6 out of 10 to 2 or 3 out of 10. This happens in nearly every instance. This is an incredible slide from Ermic. This slide reminds me of the cliche, a picture paints 1,000 words. What did these pictures say to me? What did they say to us in RMI? The bottom right-hand corner describes that we have a turtle. This turtle moves very slowly, and when danger lurks, it will retract into its shell. This turtle reminds me very much of the typical customer that we will talk to, having the RMI tell me, show me, prove it to me questions and answers. We won't dwell very long on the bottom left-hand picture because this is a company that's not evolving and will shortly die. The top left-hand quadrant gives a very striking image, an image of a herd of deer where every deer has a role in being alert and awake to the issues, alert and awake to possible threats. It reminds us very much of the difference between risk as a bolt-on and risk as a built-in feature of the fabric of the organization. Think of it this way. I remember some years ago being told of the US motor manufacturing philosophy, which was that the best people existed at the end of the production line. They were the quality assurance people. They checked that the car was functioning according to the specifications. Some years later, the Japanese decided that they could do it better. They wanted to increase efficiency. They wanted cars to last longer. But they decided that in order to do that, that everybody on the production line had to be as good as the quality folk at the end of the production line in the States, because they determined that everybody had a role to play in quality assurance. The very same applies in the case of risk management. Risk needs to be a built-in feature of the fabric and the culture of the organization and not a bolt-on, as would be the case where you have the risk management department and people either acknowledge or informally acknowledge that risk is somebody else's responsibility, the responsibility of those folk in the risk management department. Risk needs to be built in. The final image, roads to resilience, is an image of a shoal of fish which, when the great white shark lurks, they all instinctively respond and come together in a fashion that hopefully will avert danger. So when the CEO of an organization becomes alert and awake to the different types of organizations that exist today and those that are more likely to survive in the 21st century, what would he or she and the chair of the audit and risk and strategy committees, those three chairs, what kind of conversation would they be having? They might ask, how do we compare? Well, we use the Carnegie Mellon capability maturity model, and we've adapted it to risk and resilience planning. In the bottom left-hand quadrant, level 1, here we have a situation where companies receive information in many different types of formats: Word documents, PowerPoints, Excels, risk radar reports, and things like that. But most critically, what happens in a level 1 organization is you have the existence of air gaps. What's an air gap? An air gap occurs where a person is copying and pasting data. Copy and pasting data. From where? From the people who originate the information, the people who really know what's going on in the bowels of a subsidiary company. The air gaps that exist between such people and those to whom it is reported. Air gaps again appearing between reporting lines and the CEO, and further air gaps between the CEO and the main board of directors. Level 2 occurs where we have strong policy which is given teeth in the form of consistency in the application of process. So policy given teeth through the strong application of process. However, in level 2 companies, the air gaps continue to exist. And here, quite often, it is manifest in the form of Excel spreadsheets, which as they're aggregated throughout the organization, result in people having to very subjectively copy and paste and interpret with the best of intentions their comprehension of the risks that face the organisation. Level 3 mature companies are companies where we now have the emergence of consistency of data. Risk data governance is beginning to take hold. We clearly have the introduction of database solutions, but that is not what is key here. What is key here is tone set at the top, information coming up from the bottom, and people understanding what matters most to the achievement of objectives. Those all-important risk treatment plans. Level 4 is where the leading indicators of the future health of objectives in an organisation are being monitored, are being tracked. We have key performance indicators that tell us how well those risk treatment plans are performing. Level 5, at level 5 we're at a point where we have real-time dynamic reporting of risks. Levels 4 and 5 are levels where we can say that there is a high standard of risk data governance. That is to say that the rigour and the consistency which is applied to the flow of information of that risk data is as rigorous and as consistent as that which applies for accounting data, to the point that we can trust our annual reports. The same rigour and the same consistency is required for the production of information that can cause us to trust our risk reports. So I've built my case. I would now like to tell you about what operationalizing the links between risk and strategy actually means. I draw reference now to the top left-hand corner. Here we have the beginning of what we call the moments of truth in the RMI tell me, show me, prove it to me rules and tests. In this quadrant we have attached to the CEO's office what we would call an SPO, a strategic planning office. But a core capability within the strategic planning office is a risk capability. The ability to monitor, to track and to interdict where required using agreed protocols those risk treatments that are offline, that are not performing to the levels which are required, the levels which are expected when they were approved in the first instance. The CEO's office owning that SPO function is mission critical. The top right-hand quadrant is where the non-executive directors and the chief officers within an organisation engage on matters as important as the long-term purpose, the strategic plan, the strategic initiatives, the critical objectives underpinning those initiatives, the production of risk appetite statements that clearly and simply describe our appetite for the risks which exist to critical objectives, the approval of risk appetite statements, and then most importantly, the communication of those risk appetite statements to the key constituents within the entirety of the organisation. The bottom right-hand quadrant of this diagram in front of you relates to data governance. Now, clearly it requires a database solution, but that database solution needs to be aligned with ISO 31000, the new global standard. If it's not, it's akin to having an account package which is not, for example, aligned with global accounting practices. But you know, the database solution is really not what's important here. What's important here is what's gone before in the slide. How the strategic planning office, with a risk capability embedded, is integrated into the CEO office, under the direct control and influence of the CEO's office. The role of the board risk and audit committee in determining the future, the objectives, and how we're going to get there, and the threats and the risks on the journey as we're going from point A to point B. Risk data being maintained at a level of rigour and consistency, consistent with that which we apply to accounting information. Moving on then to the bottom left-hand corner, we're talking here about proving and testing. We're talking here really about the report cards from the proving and testing against those scenarios that are most likely to seriously undermine our operating model, undermine our business model, undermine reputation. Remember, brand has a value on the balance sheet, but reputation can rarely be valued until after it's lost. Those report cards that help us understand whether or not risk is built in or bolted on to the organisation. I now move on to my conclusions, my last slide. I'm giving the last word to Peter Bernstein, the author of that most incredible book, Against the Gods, The Remarkable Story of Risk. In the absence of certainty, the only way to maintain potentiality is to focus on excellent execution and demonstrable resilience at the same time while taking as much acceptable risk as reasonably possible. Board risk assurance is assurance that strategy, objectives and execution are aligned. They are aligned through the operationalization of risks and strategy. There are building blocks. The building blocks start with definition of purpose. Where are we going? What can stop us, slow us down and throw us off on our journey? The second building block is the extent to which the Strategic Planning Office, with a built-in risk capability, is influenced and integrated into the CEO's office. It can take its authority from the CEO's office. The third building block is real-time reporting, dynamic reporting of those risk treatments. How are they performing against given expectations? The fourth and final building block is risk mapping, proving and testing. Those report cards, particularly report cards on the extent to which risk and risk philosophy and risk culture are built in as opposed to being bolted onto the organisation. So there you are. That's board risk assurance. It's as simple and as complex as that. Thank you for listening.